Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I do have to start with an apology, which is, I know, going to be a deep disappointment to many of you, which is I have absolutely no slides to present. So, unfortunately, you're going to have to deal with that. I am going to shift ground pretty substantially from the presentations that we've seen so far. I'm really focused on the business implications of a lot of the technology changes that we've been talking about. And to put it into context, I think there's something that most of you understand, but just to highlight it as the context for what I'm going to say, we are at a historic moment in terms of the business challenges and opportunities relative to technology. There's a historian that many of you may be familiar with by the name of Carlota Perez, who wrote a great book on technology revolutions and financial capital. And she basically traced the whole history of major technology revolutions over the past 300 years, everything from the steam engine to electricity to the telephone. All of them caused enormous disruption in the business world. But they all had one pattern that was quite consistent. And that was that the technology innovation that came was in the form of a major innovation burst. There was a huge burst in terms of price performance driven by new technology. And then very rapidly, that price performance peaked. And there was modest incremental improvement beyond that stage, but it was relatively stable. And once you had a stable technology, you had another burst of innovation, which was around the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure to deliver that to the broader society and business world. And that, too, had a burst of innovation. You had a major rethinking of infrastructure. In the example of electricity, moving from premise-based electricity generation to centralized electricity generation. But once again, you had stabilization and then the opportunity for business to step back and say, given this new infrastructure, how would we rethink and reorganize our businesses in order to more effectively exploit that infrastructure? That pattern has been remarkably consistent until today, where we now have a digital technology infrastructure that at least so far shows no signs of stabilization. The three building blocks, computing, storage, bandwidth, all experiencing continued exponential price performance improvement. That's a huge destabilizing factor. It destabilizes it, first of all, in terms of the infrastructures. We're continuously rethinking and redefining the infrastructures that are most effective in deploying this technology. Right now in the business world, everybody's talking about cloud computing as a fundamental new infrastructure. You'd think the way they talk about it, cloud computing is everywhere. It's maybe represents about 1% of the technology resources used by business today. There's still a huge deployment process that has to go through. And I guarantee once that goes through, we're going to see other kinds of infrastructures emerge that will once again destabilize. So the bottom line is we are faced in a historical period where there is destabilization that is continuing, and there is no sign of it slowing down. So in that environment, I think there's huge opportunity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the opportunity, but I also want to talk about something that I haven't heard a lot about in the past day and a half, which is the challenge that this represents, the difficulty that this presents. One of the things we did at this Center for the Edge that I run is we looked about 18 months ago at all the indices that corporate leaders and public policy leaders look to get insight about the economy and business world. And what was interesting as you went through the list, everything from unemployment to inflation to exchange rate variations, all really important indices, but very short term in their perspective. They gave you great insight about what was happening this month, this quarter, maybe this year. On the other hand, we all, I think, have a sense, and certainly all the business executives I talk to have a sense that we're in the middle of a very profound long-term shift in terms of how we do business. But there is no index that's available to give us a sense of where we are on that shift. There's not even been an effort to characterize, much less quantify, the dimensions of that big shift. So we ended up developing an index that we call the Shift Index. It has 25 metrics. We published the first edition of it last year. The new edition was released about a month ago. And the 25 metrics try to quantify the longer-term changes that are playing out in our business world. Out of the 25 metrics, one metric in particular grabbed the attention of a lot of the business executives and the media. And it was a fairly simple question that we thought for sure had been asked and probably answered, which was just, how are companies doing? Not just over the recent quarter, not just over the recent year, but over a long stretch of time. How have companies been doing relative to the long-term changes that are playing out? To our surprise, nobody seems to have asked the question, much less answered it. So one of our metrics looked at all public companies in the United States, not just a sample, but every single public company. And we looked at it over a relatively long period of time. We went back to 1965. We said, how have companies done over that time period? And as our measure of performance, and we can debate whether this is perfect, but we think it's a reasonable proxy, we took return on assets as the measure of performance. What do you think has happened to return on assets for all public companies in the United States since 1965? It's collapsed. It's collapsed by 75% over that time period. It's been a significant and sustained erosion. It's been very consistent over this time period. There is absolutely no sign of it leveling off. There is certainly no sign of it turning around. So I think it puts in very graphic terms that these changes we're talking about, while they have a lot of opportunity attached to them, also have some extraordinary challenges. And I would go so far to be provocative and say that the management practices in business institutions that we have today are fundamentally broken. In corporate executive boardrooms, when I talk to executives, increasingly I hear the metaphor of the Red Queen. We're running faster and faster just to stay in the same place. Well, actually, the Red Queen had it really good. The Red Queen ran faster and faster and stayed in the same place. We're running faster and faster and falling farther and farther behind. So that's a completely different situation. And I think it's pretty interesting that nobody's bothered to even ask the questions, much less ask, why is this happening? Now, I think there are many reasons as to why it's happening. Part of it has to do with just intensifying competition. By one other metric that we have in the Shift Index, competitive intensity has more than doubled over this time period. But if that were all that were going on, I think we would expect, if we're believers in markets, and I certainly am a very powerful believer in markets, we would imagine that markets would have generated innovations to respond to this increasing pressure and at least been able to level off this very sustained deterioration in performance. Yet that hasn't happened. And so I think what it suggests is that what's happening is not just intensifying competition, but shifting competition. The basis of competition is shifting in a very profound way that really challenges the basic assumptions that we all have about what's required to be successful in business. And I think the two key assumptions, do it at a very high level. I wrote a book called The Power of Pull, which we published earlier this year, that really goes into a lot of the detail behind this perspective. But at a very high level, you can summarize the shift in two frames. One is moving from a world of push to a world of pull. We're moving from a world where the success of business was around predicting or forecasting demand, and based on that prediction or forecast, ensuring that you had all the right people and the right resources in the right place at the right time to meet that demand. Created enormous companies, created enormous wealth, very successful. In a world that's more rapidly changing and more uncertain, where the black swans that Taleb talks about will occur with increasing frequency, that model may be challenged. And in that kind of world, maybe we need to move to a world of pull, where the whole focus is on designing scalable pull platforms where you can draw out people and resources when you need them, where you need them. Very different model in terms of basis of competition. When I talk about pull to business executives, they think about lean manufacturing and pull inventory systems. That's actually a very modest manifestation of pull. We're talking about scalable pull platforms where you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in many cases even millions of participants in these pull platforms. Very different challenge. And just to be provocative, I'll make the assertion without supporting it at this point that most of the institutional innovation around moving from these push to pull models is not occurring here in the United States. It's occurring in China and India, in a whole array of industries where you're getting very sophisticated, scalable pull platforms emerging. Second way of framing this is around the movement from stocks to flows. In business, in the past, the way you created value was by acquiring proprietary knowledge, aggressively holding on to that knowledge, preventing anyone else from getting access to it, and then as efficiently as possible, extracting the value of that knowledge. Again, created huge value, huge companies. The challenge is, in a world of more rapid change, as knowledge stocks depreciate at an accelerating rate, if all you do is hold on to that knowledge, you will be protecting a diminishing value asset. And the real requirement in that kind of world is how do you more effectively participate in a broader range of richer flows of knowledge and learn faster from the knowledge that you're accessing. Very different kind of approach, very difficult for most executives, traditional executives, to implement. Now, I think some of the implications of this, and unfortunately with limited time I can't go into great detail, but I'll just highlight some of the implications that I think are very important for business people to understand and focus on. First of all, when I talk about knowledge flows, most people tend to think about large databases floating in cyberspace. That's an important element, and I don't want to diminish that. But I would make the case that the most valuable knowledge is ironically the one that is in more and more relative scarcity, and that is tacit knowledge. It's the knowledge that we all have in our heads that we have a very hard time even expressing to ourselves, much less to anyone else. That knowledge does not flow very easily, and yet it's the most valuable knowledge that one can access in a time of rapid change. So the challenge is, how do you access that knowledge? And I think that leads to a second implication, which is increasingly the success of business will depend on the ability to build long-term, trust-based relationships. Knowledge, tacit knowledge does flow if you have a trust-based relationship with the other individual. If you have trust, that individual is willing to make a bit of a fool of themselves as they struggle for words and make mistakes as they try to express what they know. If they don't have that trust, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to get them to provide that knowledge, to access that knowledge. So that's a second implication. Third implication is that increasingly we have to focus in business on talent development as a key business objective. And I think it goes to challenge our whole view of what firms are and what institutions are. And I should say, by the way, that when I talk about institutions being broken, I'm focusing on business institutions. I think all institutions are broken. Educational institutions are push-based institutions. They're not pull-based institutions. Government institutions are push-based institutions. They're broken as well. So while I'm talking about business right now, I don't want to be just limited to that. So I think that in that context, the rationale for the firm moves from what Ronald Coase so compellingly described back in the 30s, which is efficiency of coordination of activity. The reason you come together in firms is to more efficiently coordinate activity. I think that rationale becomes less compelling. And increasingly, the rationale for why people would come together in institutions is because they will learn faster. They will drive their performance more rapidly by being part of an institution than by simply being on their own. And that requires a fundamental rethinking of what a business institution is. If you took talent development seriously, and I'm not talking about training programs, I'm talking about rethinking the day-to-day work experience. If you took that really seriously and said talent development's our top priority in the day-to-day work experience, what would you do differently in the company? And I think that's a fundamental change. So I don't want to be too negative. I think the other opportunity here, though, is that if we understand what's going on and the kinds of technology capabilities that are available in the technology infrastructure, for the first time, we have the opportunity to turn in the business world from a diminishing returns performance curve, which is so compellingly described in Boston Consulting Group's experience curve, which is a remarkably accurate description of how performance improves in industry after industry. We have the opportunity to turn that on its side and create an increasing returns performance curve, where the more the people that participate, the more rapidly everybody else learns. And that's a remarkable opportunity. So I think there's huge wealth to be created, but it requires challenging some of the most basic assumptions that we have about what's required for business success. So with that, let me open it up for some questions. Thank you.